Chapter 9. When he awoke, Carbonaro had already left. Whenever they had sex, she was off to the showers and back in her bunk in less than 20 minutes. Dickerson wished it was different, but he wasn't sure she even had a romantic side. Didn't matter. She was a fuck buddy, and he knew that's as far as their relationship would ever get. Dickerson rose from the communal bed and stretched. The room had no windows, no terminals, nothing apart from an AI cam in the upper corner making sure violence or assault didn't occur. You often wondered exactly how the AIs decided what was just sex and what was actually an assault. When someone like Carbonaro decided to knock boots, a few bruises here and there was expected. The woman was a damned reactor for passionate sex, followed by the sorrow of an empty bed. He slowly dressed and checked the time. They'd fucked 3 times in the last hour, and that was one less hour he had to sleep, real sleep, before Reveille woke him for the loadout. Dickerson sighed as he pulled on his boots. He checked to make sure he and Carbonaro had left nothing in the room and stepped out. As soon as he closed the door, he heard the whine of the grav plates cease and the sterilization routine kick in. The room would be ready for the next sexual rendezvous inside of a minute. Yawning, Dickerson walked down the hall toward the barracks. His coffin, the 1.5-meter high cocoon of metal and plasteel, awaited him with cool sheets and a warm blanket. He was looking forward to climbing in, sliding on the top, and reading from one of the classics. He was sure that by the time he managed 4 or 5 pages, he'd be fast asleep. He considered going to the rec area and having one last vape to help him sleep, but decided against it. Carbonaro had worn him out. In a good way, of course, but he was exhausted. Between her and the exertion from the training exercise, he was ready to go to sleep. The hallways were practically deserted. He passed a few nom-rates, mostly private and PFCs, but they were locked in their own conversations, presumably headed for the conjugal areas. Day after tomorrow, he'd be back in space and headed way the hell past Pluto. These Marines? They would undoubtedly spend more time marking time, being bored, and losing their edge. Trident Station only had 3 S&R teams, and the rest of the Marines at the large station were either newbies getting trained up or Marines that have fucked up so badly they've been shunted to the outer reach for disciplinary reasons. If you weren't S&R, Neptune was the last place you wanted to be stationed. Dickerson saw lights in the briefing room. He yawned again, his body trying to tell him it was time to hit the coffin, but he couldn't resist. As quietly as he could, in case an officer or an NCO was inside, he breached the room's threshold and peered in. Corporal Calimura, still dressed in the same jumpsuit she'd worn to the briefing, stood before the large holo display at the back of the room. On the screen was the model of an intact T-87. She seemed to be studying its every angle, her fingers waving in the air and rotating the diagram. "Excuse me, Corporal," he said quietly. She stiffened almost imperceptibly and turned her head to look at him. "Dickerson, what is it?" "May I join you?" She blinked at him, thought for a moment, and finally nodded. Calimura immediately refocused her attention on the holo. She waved her hand again, and the pristine T-87 fell into the shape of the wreck they'd trained on that morning. She stepped back from the model. "What are you still doing up?" she asked without turning to him. Dickerson walked to the holo display and stood to the left and slightly behind her. "Just wandering around. Was planning on hitting the coffin soon, but I'm a bit of a nosy bastard." He nodded to the display. "Just wanted to see what you were doing with the T-87. "Trying to get better," she said. "Still trying to figure out what I should have done to protect my squad." "You have the holo recordings?" "Of course," she said. "Okay," Dickerson said. "Then let's see them." She commanded the display to replay the holos. The 2 Marines watched in silence as the scenario played out. Dickerson watched as one of Kali's fire teams crept around the starboard side. "Freeze," he said to the display. The corporal glanced at him in irritation, crossed her arms, and waited. "Zoom in starboard side, ISO view." The display followed his commands, the image turning and twisting as the view changed from head-on to isometric. Kelly's fire team, Went and Elliot, were frozen near the corner, their weapons pointed in front of them. Dickerson gestured at the pair of Marines. See that? See how they're bunched up and not even bothering to check for threats above or behind? Kelly nodded. Sloppy, damn sloppy. The two of them know better. So why didn't they get in position? She asked. He locked eyes with her. Because you didn't tell them to. Kelly blinked. What do you mean? If they know better, then why? Because, he interrupted, you didn't tell them to. You're going to fight alongside both inexperienced and experienced Marines. You're going to command both as well. And these idiots, he gestured to the display, were waiting for instructions. Not because they don't know any better, but because they know you don't. She opened her mouth to speak and closed it. He could see her mind turning over his words, testing his reasoning. After a moment, she sighed. You're telling me I need to treat everyone as though they don't know any better. He nodded. You have to command or they won't command themselves. In a real situation, I guarantee you Went and Elliot would have done the right thing. But you can't take that chance. Don't assume the grunts know jack shit. That's why you're an NCO and we're still nom-rates. We're tools, he said. Learn to wield us. Learn to use us. Learn how to make us kill for you. Dickerson waved at the display. Play. The scenario played out. Went and Elliot came around the side just in time for Dickerson and his partner to light them up. He knew that on the T-87's port side, the other squad was getting a taste of paralysis rounds and humiliation. Kelly looked as though she wanted to cover her eyes, whether in disbelief or embarrassment, he wasn't sure. And they're dead, she said quietly. Just like that. Dickerson nodded. Just like that. She rewound the recording and the two of them viewed it from the port angle. They watched it play out in silence. He glanced down and saw her hands were clenched into fists, the fingers pale from the effort. Dickerson looked up just in time to watch the ambush. It was fantastic. Murdoch and Copenhagen wiped out Cali's port fire team with such ease, it was hard to believe Carbonaro and Nero were even Marines. They might as well have been kids, and pretty dumb ones at that. Dickerson waited as the silence lingered. The corporal kept replaying the port ambush from different angles, seeing how Cartwright's Marines had snuck through the wreckage to end up flanking her squad. Both Copenhagen and Murdoch moved with incredible grace before sneaking up on the enemy and dispatching them with ease. She shook her head. Should know better. Carbonaro does. Nero is a private. He's green like you. She glared at him when she heard the words, but he didn't back off. He's new to ZG combat and doesn't yet think in 3 dimensions. He had a high combat rating for ground assaults, but until arriving here at Neptune, he'd never been in any ZG scenarios. Carbonaro didn't lead him. Correct, Dickerson said, because she was waiting for you to lead. You wanted to send a nanoprobe out. Talby nixed it to teach you a lesson. Which was? She asked. Maybe to impress upon you how important it is to assume nothing about your Marines. They're your charges. They're your responsibility. And you have to think when they can't or shouldn't. He paused and looked back at the screen. You're an NCO now, Corporal. You were fast-tracked for promotion. That means the brass has an interest in you. Hell, you could eventually end up commissioned for all I know. But for that to happen, you need to pass ZG combat training, right? She said nothing. So start leading. You're a smart woman, Corporal. Don't let them make you feel dumb. Her fists unclenched. She slowly turned her head to him, her eyes filled with anger. Are you trying to say the rest of S&R Black thinks I'm dumb? No, Corporal, he said. With respect, you've been acting like it. You haven't asked our opinions. You give orders, the squad follows them. If you ask them questions, they'll respond. And as any green commissioned officer knows, you always listen to the NCOs. And for green NCOs, they have to listen to the nom-rates. Does that make sense? Yes, she said after a long moment. He waited for her to rip his head off, yell at him in that feminine growl of hers that sounded like a panther on a killing spree. He'd spoken a little too frankly for decorum's sake, but it was the truth. She appeared to know it, too. "Thank you, Lance Corporal Dickerson." "You're welcome, Corporal." She stared at the display one last time before turning it off. The images disappeared, leaving them alone in the empty briefing room. "Tell me, Dickerson." He raised his eyebrows. "Why are you still a non-rate?" He laughed. "That's a good question. Let's just say I have a few black marks in my dossier." He tapped his left shoulder. "You saw the scars today?" She nodded. "I've been to the brig 3 times, taken punishment twice, and was damn near thrown out of the Marines. They don't want someone like me anywhere near a command position." "Insubordination? Slugging an NCO?" He blinked. "You read my jacket." She nodded. "Standard procedure for all—" "I know, Corporal," he said. "I used to be an NCO, as I'm sure you read." She said nothing. "I'm not a loose cannon," he said, "but I don't like being given orders that will obviously endanger my fellow Marines, especially those under my charge." She placed her hands in her lap, the fingers curling together. "So what happened?" Memories of that night popped into his mind. He pushed them away with effort before finally managing a smile. "That's a story for another night. Right now I need sleep." He pointed at her. "And so do you, Corporal, if you don't mind me saying." She loosed a long sigh. "You're right. Reveille is going to suck." "You can say that again." "Thank you again, Dickerson." "My pleasure, Corporal." He almost reached out to touch her shoulder, but stopped himself. At that moment, she looked more like a friend than an NCO. He had to remind himself of his station, not to mention hers. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm headed to my coffin." "Of course," she said with a wave. He spun on his heel and walked out of the briefing room. Dickerson felt her eyes on his back as he departed, wondering what she was thinking as he headed off to sleep.